So I was planning to give sort of a little speech welcoming people to Georgia Tech, but it turns out that there's a much better way to do that. So earlier this week at the Freshman Convocation, which is an official event held to welcome people coming to Georgia Tech, there was a second-year mechanical engineering undergraduate student who was asked to give a talk, and I thought that I would simply show that for you today.
Because we want to do the impossible, and this school is equipped with the resources and faculty to help us do just that. And so, in the words of Sir Isaac Newton, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Georgia Tech is proud of its many traditions, but the one I find most exciting is our tradition of excellence. Our mission as students is not to follow in the footsteps of the astronauts, Nobel Prize laureates, and presidents who graduated before us, but to exceed their footsteps, crush the shoulders of the giants upon whom we stand. We here are all such innovative people, so I am telling you, if you want to change the world, you're at Georgia Tech. You can do that. If you want to build the Iron Man suit, you're at Georgia Tech. You can do that. If you want to play theme music during your thoughts, like a badass, you're at Georgia Tech. We can do that. I am doing that.
There's a little bit more.
Congratulations on your acceptance. And brace yourselves for a hell of a ride on your way to becoming a hell of an engineer.
All right, so very good. Welcome to Georgia Tech, those of you that are new here. So you've seen the title for my talk, and the title for the talk today is motivated by this book, The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize, written by Peter Doty, and I'll tell you a little bit about Peter Doty in a few minutes. But Peter Doty is an Australian, and so he has a fairly mild-mannered title for this book, you know, The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, this is America. We need to be a little bit more forceful about these things. If you go to a bookstore and you look in the self-help section, you'll find books that really tell you how to do things. So, for example, The Stress-Free You, How to Live Stress-Free and Feel Great Every Day Starting Today. Well, that sounds pretty good. And then another one you might find is Happiness Habits, Instant Happiness in 15 minutes or less. Right? And you can see you go from a frowny face to a smiley face. So following those principles, that's the title for my talk today, which is How to Win the Nobel Prize and Change the World. Well, we're going to change the world while we're at it. So in all seriousness, I do want to talk about this idea of how we achieve something really big. Okay, and that's the message from Doty's book. He has a whole series of points that he goes through in the book about how to do really, really excellent scientific research. And I've taken a number of them today. And so what we'll do in the first part of the talk, I'm going to go through 11 short points that he makes and illustrate some of those. And then in the second part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific habits that we can all have that might get us to doing that kind of work. So let me begin by telling you about Peter Doty. As I said, he's Australian, so you see a picture of him there receiving the Nobel Prize. He got the Nobel Prize in 1996 for work in immunology. He grew up in Brisbane, which is a city in Australia, and he went to Indooroopilly High School, which one of the reasons I put it there is that's just one of those crazy Australian words that's great to say. But the other point is this is just a regular suburban high school. So I know where it is. I know people who live there. His parents were not especially well educated. He went to the University of Queensland, studied veterinary science. He then went on to do a PhD in England and returned to Australia where he did a postdoc. The work for which he won the Nobel Prize was done as a postdoc. So he was not that different in age from most of you when he did that work. But you can see it took many years for him perhaps to be recognized at least by the Nobel Prize. And so he's a very, very accomplished individual who came from somewhat humble beginnings. One of his other accomplishments was that in 1997 he was, sorry about that, he was chosen to be Australian of the Year. You can imagine there's just one person a year chosen for this honour. So that's great that Australia is able to choose a scientist. But just so you don't get too carried away, I'll point out that 12 years earlier, this guy was Australian of the Year. So, you know, you've got to get your priorities straight. Okay, so that's Peter Doty. And now let's look at some of the principles that he describes for doing Nobel Prize winning work. So the first one is try to solve major problems and make big discoveries. Well, that makes sense. You've got to do something big. We, in fact, sort of try and encapsulate that in the slogan of the school, think big, solve big, in the idea that we really should be at least attempting to identify in any field that we work, what are some key questions? If we're working on something that's small and incremental, then that's the best we could possibly do. On the other hand, at least if we know what the wonderful problems are, then we have the possibility of making progress in terms of those areas. I want to show you just a couple of examples of people who've done this successfully. So the first example is, this is another Australian guy. This is Barry Marshall, won the 2005 Nobel Prize in Medicine. He overturned hundreds and hundreds of years of accepted wisdom by showing that ulcers and gastritis are caused predominantly by a bacteria, not by stress. Okay, so he really had thought about this for a long time. He'd done a lot of different experiments trying to prove his idea that hadn't really worked out. And so finally one day he did something that was really bold. It's not something I would recommend to any of you. He cultured a Petri dish full of this bacteria and he drank it. And so his objective in doing this was to give himself an ulcer. And he believed that he would probably get an ulcer, but probably it would take several years. So let's see how that worked out for him. So he did this in 1984. After 3 days he had severe nausea, and it turned out that his mother realized he had terrible breath. And so that was a good thing, because it said that something weird was going on in his stomach. Days 5 to 8. Vomiting and massive stomach inflammation. You know, he was really excited at this point, I think, because, you know, he's clearly making progress. And the next one is the one that tells you how dedicated this guy was. It wasn't until day 14 that he started to treat it. And so he waited for 2 whole weeks to let his stomach do its thing to make sure that that was really the effect. Now, one interesting thing is, in this experiment, he didn't get anything about ulcers, because he didn't get an ulcer. He got gastritis. And so it took later work again for him to really show that this was active for ulcers as well. But this has made a huge difference in the world. Now when people all around the world get ulcers, they are given antibiotics, and they can typically be cleared up very, very quickly. So this is a great example of someone who really thought big. So I've so far shown you 2 examples that are at least motivational to me, because these are people that come from a background similar to mine. Okay, they both grew up in just normal families in Australia. There was nothing special about their family, and yet they were able to go on and do something really remarkable. I want to show you one example now of someone who certainly hasn't won the Nobel Prize, but I hope is motivational to most of you, because he's someone that sat in this room not so many years ago. This is Kwang-Hun Chung, who's now an assistant professor at MIT, but completed his PhD here in 2009. He worked with Dr. Hang Liu, who's hiding in the corner over there. And while Kwang-Hun was here, he did really beautiful work in Dr. Liu's work using microfluidics in a way that really revolutionized how a number of people in certain areas of biology did their experiments. After he left here, he went to Stanford and took over a project there. And the idea of his project was motivated by the following observation. If you take anyone's brain or the brain of a mouse, that is an opaque object. And so if we look at it with a microscope, we can only see what's on the surface. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could image all the way through the brain? And so that was what he tried to do. So he developed a method where he could essentially soak this brain in a solution for 2 days. That's the same brain that you see there, and it's now optically transparent. However, it's optically transparent in a way that maintains the full cellular structure of the brain. And so now by doing confocal microscopy, it's possible to image all the way through that brain in 3 dimensions. This is a remarkable thing. I mean, I think this is something now that again will really revolutionize how people look at these sorts of things. I asked Dr. Liu a couple of days ago, what were a couple of the characteristics of Kwang Hun when he was here, when he was a graduate student? And she actually wrote me a very long, very interesting email, and I've just abstracted a couple of things here. So one is that he was extremely motivated and always wanted to be challenged. And so this, I think, is important. He wasn't willing just to do the minimum work required to do something, but he was always interested in what's the largest accomplishment that I can make with some particular experiment or idea that we're trying to explore. The other one that I think is very interesting is he knew what his weaknesses were and really worked on them. So the one that Professor Liu mentioned to me is that when he first came here from Korea, his English was very weak. And so he set out a program for himself to systematically improve his English. He read a book in English each month. He listened to podcasts in English. He played poker with American friends each weekend in order to improve his English. And he moved out from his roommate into a roommate who spoke English so he could learn English. And I'll assure you, because I had a meal with him not so long ago, that now his English is superb. And so really the thing here is that he was thinking about what is something that holds me back from accomplishing, and instead of just saying, well, that's the way life is, he really decided to work hard and do things about it. All right, so let's look at some of the other things that Doty suggests about winning the Nobel Prize. Acquire the basic skills and work with the right people. To do scientific research, you just have to be part of the scientific community. And I think by coming to the graduate program at Georgia Tech, you're in a wonderful place to do that. So I think we do provide the right people, and you really have an opportunity to learn these things in an in-depth way. Okay, so next thing is to talk about the problem. And the idea here is that novel insights often come not just from an individual. It's extremely rare for anyone these days to make a major research advance by just sitting in a room and coming up with their own idea. You have to be constantly in discussion with people, both in your particular community, but also within the broader community. Many times, good ideas come from analogies between different areas. You should always be looking for opportunities to talk about your work, either informally or formally. I would recommend that if you ever have an opportunity to give a talk about your research, you should say yes. You should always say yes, because almost every time in explaining your work to a new audience, you will find some new way to think about your particular work. Learn to write clearly and concisely. I think Doty puts this really well. Science is about telling good, readable, memorable stories. And so, rather than belabor this point, I want to show you an example of one of these things. This was an example that was pointed out to me by a colleague last week. And so this is a paper, titled, "Can Apparent Superluminal Neutrino Speeds Be Explained as a Quantum Weak Measurement?" Now, a couple of years ago, there were some folks in Europe who were doing experiments that they thought showed neutrinos could travel faster than the speed of light. And so at the time, there was a great deal of interest in the physics community about if this is possible, how does it happen? And one possible mechanism was this so-called quantum weak effect. Okay, so this is a paper by Michael Berry and some other people. Michael Berry actually is a very famous physicist. Could potentially win the Nobel Prize one day. He's got something called the Berry phase in quantum physics named after him. And so this is a pretty dense, complicated looking paper, and they were trying to craft their paper to give a succinct story answering this question. And so here is their abstract in its entirety. So that's a little bit glib, maybe, but in fact I think it's a wonderful example of clear scientific communication. Because in their community, you can now read the paper and there's all the calculations and all that stuff, and it's all backed up. But at the end of the day, all you need to know is the answer to the question. And the answer to the question is no, it's probably not. Okay? All right, so let me give you just a couple more pointers about writing clearly and concisely. My recommendation is that you start writing a paper sooner than you even believe is possible in a project. If you wait until you think you're done with the project to start writing a paper, that's months or maybe even years too late. You should start on the first day of the project and sketch out what you think a paper will look like. Now, almost surely the final paper will look different, but if you can't sketch out what the paper looks like at the beginning, you're probably on a fishing expedition. You're probably going to look around all kinds of different things before you actually come to the core idea that you're working on. This also goes along with the idea that you can use writing as a way to work out your ideas. You shouldn't think of writing as something you do after the fact once everything is complete, but instead you can use writing as a way to explore what you're trying to do in a particular piece of work. Scientific writing is not just words, but words, tables, and figures are all equally important. Many people write scientific papers by first making all the figures. And it's important to learn to really pay attention to the way you make figures. Just making any old figure with Excel is not going to cut it, but you can really think about how to communicate things by the way you present the information in your paper. So I'm actually going to give you an exercise here. You should find examples of good writing. Don't just sort of imagine this will magically happen to you, but find examples in your field that you think are particularly clear and analyze what's good about them. What is it that makes the writing clear? And then you can try and emulate that in your own writing. Okay, his next point, focus, don't be a dilettante. So this is the idea that often to make a true large achievement in any area requires a sustained effort, often over many years. And so if you're switching around in your career and doing all kinds of different things, it's actually fairly unlikely that you'll really make a big contribution in one area. Now, a while ago I was thinking about how to explain to our staff how a professor's mind works, and I was able to come up with this description. And so here's a sort of diagram of a professor's mind: science, students, postdocs, grants and sponsors, teaching and undergrads, and everything else. So I showed this actually to Dennis Hess, and he looked at that for a while and he said, well, I think the section for everything else is a bit too large. But this underlines the fact that you do need a sort of somewhat monomaniacal attitude to really make a large contribution in terms of research. It has to be something that you're thinking about all the time and that you think about for a very extended period of time to truly become an expert in an area. And if you think you can just parachute in for a short period of time and make a huge contribution, then that's very, very unlikely to happen. So the exercise for this part is to find one of the seminal papers in your field. In almost every field, there's a couple of papers that truly change the way people think about something. And the suggestion I have here is find one of those papers, but then track the ideas back in the lead author's work and see how far they go. So my experience is when you try and do this, that typically you find that that seminal paper is the nth paper in a series that's been going on for years and years. It's not the first output. Just to illustrate this idea that really large breakthroughs typically happen after very extended periods of work. All right, his next comment, be generous and culturally aware. You can always make friends in the scientific community by acknowledging the work of others. It's a very, very easy thing to do. All you have to do is know about their work and then be generous in giving credit. Peter Doty, in terms of the Nobel Prize, describes this a bit more pointedly. He says, when it comes to awards and prizes, it is probably important to have as few enemies as possible. Okay, and that's true in many aspects of life. It turns out in doing scientific research, it is easy to avoid having enemies simply by being generous with credit to the people that are around you. This one I hope I don't have to belabor, but it's important. Tell the truth. We have to be absolutely truthful about our data and about other people's data, and there's just no wiggle room in this at all. So it's something that we have to have very, very high standards of integrity. Be persistent, but be prepared to fail. So I think Doty describes this very well. People who can't deal with failure or acknowledge to themselves that they have been wrong should probably avoid a life in doing research. Doing research involves lots of time thinking you understand something and then realizing you do not understand it, or that it's been done incorrectly, or that someone else has done it first. And you have to be relentlessly optimistic in being able to keep going forward despite the barriers that you'll see along the way in terms of going through this process. The second last point that he makes is that your time is precious. That's true for everyone. One of the particular things that hit home to me as I was reading his books was some advice that you could perhaps argue that I'm in the midst of ignoring, which is to avoid administrative posts. So in thinking about this, I showed you before an image of what a professor's brain looks like, but I was actually able also to find a picture of how professors think administrators' brains work. Okay, so this is how my colleagues view administrators' brains as working. And so I promise I will try and fight against that as we go forward, but we'll see how it works. But it's true that your time is precious, and you have to look at all the things you're trying to get done in life, but really try and protect the time that you have when you can do the core parts of your research. And I'll talk about in the second part of the talk what I think some of those core things are. The final point that I'll take away from Doty's list is take care of yourself and live a long life. It took 25 years for him to be recognized for that work to get the Nobel Prize, and it often takes a long time either to get recognition, or in many of our cases we're interested in developing ideas that will go out and be implemented in industry, and the best case is that that's going to take many years to occur. Okay, so he has a list of things here about good habits, and he points out in his book that he personally knows individuals who've been taken out of scientific research by all of these things. Okay, so take care of your mental health. If you're having mental health issues, seek help for it. There's help that's readily available. Take regular exercise. He says avoid extreme sports, so don't join the snowmobile jumping team or whatever it is you were thinking of doing. So here's a bunch of other points that go towards doing this idea of winning the Nobel Prize, but I hope already that I've given you some sense that there are ways that we can think about our research that greatly increase the probability that we might make some major accomplishment. So what I'd like to do in the second part of the talk is talk about some of the particular skills that we need in order to get to that goal on a day-to-day basis. And so in order to do that, I actually have to give you a short demonstration. So some of you know that I play the violin. And so you can relax. I'm just going to play a little tiny bit of music for you. If you like, you can just close your eyes and enjoy it. And then we're going to talk about why this is related to doing good scientific research. Thank you very much. What I want you to think about, though, is although maybe I hope you got some enjoyment from playing the violin, there is no way that anyone would mistake me for a world-class soloist. And so I just want to play a little bit of music from someone who truly is a world-class soloist. All right, now he's making me feel bad, so I'm going to stop. So Gil Shaham, wonderful international soloist, and what I want you to think about here is what is it that makes the difference between someone like me that maybe plays at some acceptable amateur level and someone who's truly wonderful at playing music. Okay, and I want you to think about the analogy with doing research. All of you, by getting a graduate degree from Georgia Tech, will be at the level where you will greatly impress your family and friends, and justifiably so, by really making a great achievement. However, that doesn't mean that within your small research community you'll be making a world-class achievement in that research. So I want to think about what's the difference between those two groups. If I can get this back to working again. This idea of looking at, oh, I just have to mention also, by the way, the beauty of the internet is that anyone can comment on things. So this was one of the comments under Gil Shaham. I'm going to play it on my electric guitar. To which I think, please don't, you know. All right, so what's all this got to do with scientific research? One of the people who studied world-class expertise is this guy, Anders Ericsson, who's at Florida State University. And in a really famous paper that actually was published just as I was finishing my PhD, he studied what's now called deliberate practice. And the way that he did this is he studied people who were learning the violin. Okay, so he and his colleagues went to a German music conservatory, and they divided the students into 3 groups by getting advice from the faculty there. They had a group that was predicted to become world-class soloists. So these were the so-called best students. There was another group of students who were going to be good violinists, much better than me, but not world-class individuals. And then there was a different program where people were being trained to be music teachers, and so they were not nearly as good at playing the violin. They did all kinds of studies. They made these people fill out time diaries and collected all kinds of information about what was the difference between the best group and the others. Everybody agreed at the end that the single factor that dictated how good someone was how much time they spent intensively practicing their instrument by themselves. It didn't count if they were playing with friends or playing in an orchestra or something, but it's that time when they really spent focusing individually that made a huge difference. So in fact, then they did a retrospective study to decide how much time people had spent doing things. And so here's a chart from their paper. Now, you know, those curves look suspiciously smooth, but that's because this is from a retrospective study. So what they're showing here is that by the time they were about age 20, the violinists in that best group had accumulated more than 10,000 hours of this intensive practice. On the other hand, the students from the good and then the teachers group had accumulated thousands of hours less of study. By the way, when I was looking at this, I tried to figure out where I would fall on the curve. And when I was age 18, I think I'd accumulated about 2,000 hours. And so I was way below the average here. The point here, this has now become almost a piece of popular folklore that it takes 10,000 hours of practice in order to become a true expert at some skill. So this is the original paper where this came from. Similar results have been seen in other, both music, but also things like chess. A couple of things that I want you to think about in terms of doing research. The first is, how long does it take to get 10,000 hours of experience? Well, that's not too hard to figure out. It turns out that if you're doing it 20 hours a week, it'll take you 10 years. And if you're doing it 40 hours a week, then it'll take you 5 years. So at least in terms of thinking of doing a PhD, if you're really intensively working, I'll talk about how it may actually not be possible to achieve this goal, but at least it's possible to get a long way up this curve in the time that it takes to do a PhD. Here's the other thing. You might look at this and think this is a little depressing. When I look at this, I realize I will never, ever be a world-class violinist. Even if I stopped everything today, quit my job, and just stayed home and practiced the violin, I'm about 50,000 hours of experience behind these other people, and I will never catch up. But here's the point I want to make to you about doing research. At the beginning of your PhD, everybody's at 0. In terms of doing research, even if you've had experience doing undergrad research, the amount of exposure that's given to you in terms of research is a small number. And so everybody at every university around the world, when you start your PhD, starts at 0 on this figure. And really then, you have a choice about how far you can go up in the time. And again, the point of all these time studies that people have done is that even when they try and capture differences between people, are there innate talents and so on, really at the end of the day, it's this application that matters. So then let's look at some of the characteristics of this world-class expertise. In Ericsson's work, he distinguishes between 2 types of expertise, and I think it's useful to think about that in terms of doing a PhD. The first is expert performance. mastery of available knowledge, or current performance standards. Clearly, completing a PhD qualifies you at this level. It puts you in a very, very small fraction of all people in the world, and it really requires a high level of information in your subject domain. There's another level of performance, though, that I think is desirable to think about, and that is eminent performance. This is going beyond available knowledge to produce a unique contribution to the domain. This is the kind of thing that wins the Nobel Prize, that changes the world, that creates new companies. Okay, these are the things that go beyond just what anyone in any PhD program can do and really sets out to be a special achievement. Ericsson's comment on this is the probability of making eminent contributions is related to the amount of deliberate practice directed toward that goal. In fact, Ericsson's work stakes out a very, very strong position, which is there are essentially no innate talents in most fields. It is not true that some people are innately more talented at playing the violin than other people. Instead, it's essentially the amount of work that goes into it and the way that they do that work that makes the difference. So let's look at some of the characteristics of deliberate practice. So the first is that it's hard work. There's no way around this, that if you're doing something that constitutes deliberate practice, it's intensive work and you really have to focus and do it. In terms of looking at musicians, what people have decided is no one can really do this kind of practice for more than 60 or 90 minutes before needing a break, because of the kinds of focus and attention that's needed. I said before that, well, if you do it for 40 hours a week, I don't think anyone can do this for 40 hours a week. Not the kind of focused, concentrated effort that really contributes. We can all certainly work for 40 or more hours a week, but the kind of time that really gives this effort is something that's very special. The next point is deliberate practice frequently involves extreme attention to small details. I'm going to show you one more thing with my violin. When I was an undergraduate student, I was studying physics, but I won a music scholarship to go and have violin lessons at the local music conservatory. And so that was great. And I'd been doing that for a couple of months. And one time my teacher, who was a professor there, invited me to come along to one of the violin technique classes they had. I thought, this is great. I'm going to finally figure out, how people become really wonderful. And so we went along and they were working on bowing technique. And so we all stood in the classroom, 6 or 7 of us. And he said, okay, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to play an F on the D string, and we will play it up bow staccato. So we all played. And he said, okay, very good, let's do it again. And he would go around the room and make very minor adjustments. Lift your elbow a little bit, use a little bit more weight on your finger. And we did that for an hour. It was incredibly tedious. In fact, I have to say, I never went back. I think at that point in my life I realized, I'm not going to be a professional violinist and I can live without this. Nevertheless, I think it illustrates the point that in the domain where we truly, truly want to excel, we have to have fantastic attention to detail, and we have to spend a lot of time doing things that just cannot be accomplished in any way but careful hard work. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about here is that superb mastery of skills often makes people seem like they have almost superhuman abilities. And I'll talk about this in terms of music. If you go to an amateur music group, you will find that they spend most of the time in rehearsal doing things like fixing wrong notes or deciding how fast the piece will be, then going back and fixing those wrong notes again, and doing a lot of very mundane kinds of things. However, if you go to an Atlanta Symphony rehearsal or some other high-level professional group, they spend no time doing that at all. They are talking about and thinking about music on an entirely different plane. Their ability to understand how things fits together just works in a phenomenally different way. The same happens in doing research. If you're doing research at a functional level, then you have to spend all of your mental energy just to do the little tasks that you have to accomplish to get through your research goal. However, the people who are truly achieving great things with research can do those things with just a fraction of their mental energy, and that leaves mental energy for them to really understand the context and understand how things fit together. One of the things I'd suggest is that you should look around and find people, either here at Georgia Tech or elsewhere that you know, that fit into this character of people who seem to have transcendent abilities to do research. And think about what is different about how they do it. I've had the opportunity actually to play in a number of musical groups where we had true professionals come and work with us, and it's just remarkable to watch these people work. The same thing could be true in terms of doing research. So here's Ericsson again. The differences between expert performers and normal adults reflect a lifelong period of deliberate effort to improve performance in a specific domain. Remember when I talked about Doty's list for winning the Nobel Prize? One of them was to focus over a long period of time. This is the same message here. You can't just focus on it for a week or a month. This is something that truly has to be a year upon year upon year effort, and by doing that, then it's possible to achieve at the very highest levels. Okay, it's traditional at the end of a seminar, and you'll find as we go through the semester that there's a traditional structure to a seminar. We have someone come, they talk about their work, they'll probably talk for longer than I have today, and then they'll thank people at the end, and they'll open the floor for questions. So rather than do that, I'm going to turn it on its head today, and I'm going to pose questions to you that I want you to think about in response to what we've talked about today. So the first question is, what are the skills that contribute to performing research at an elite level? So I've given this example of playing a musical instrument. I think hopefully most of us can relate to that. But I'd like you to think about, in terms of doing scientific research, what are the specific activities where any of us could improve by doing deliberate practice? And how do elite researchers differ from run-of-the-mill normal researchers by doing those things? Second question is, what specific activities constitute deliberate practice for research performance? Once you've figured out, let's say the activity is writing clearly. That's great. Everybody would agree, I hope, that writing clearly is going to contribute to your ability to make big discoveries. But how do you get better at it? You can't just sit at home in front of the TV and think, boy, I hope tomorrow I write more clearly. That's not going to work. You have to actually do something. And so for each of those skills, think about a way to practice those skills. Are there specific skills? Think about what I was showing you with the up bow and the violin. I mean, that's not a lot of fun to have to practice that. But on the other hand, if I truly wanted to play like Gil Shahan, that's something that I would have to do. I would have to have that superb kind of control. Again, it's fine to think about these things, but if some time from now you can't point at least to yourself about where this deliberate practice comes on your calendar, it's not going to make any difference. We'll have had a nice time this afternoon, but it won't actually be making any difference to the way that you achieve things. So the last couple of questions are a bit more personal for you to think about. Are you personally motivated enough to perform research at an elite level? I've tried to argue that in order to perform research at a truly elite level requires a very, very sustained level of effort over an extended period of time. That's only possible if you are strongly motivated to do it. So I think you should think about what motivates you to do your PhD or to work hard at your postdoc work or whatever aspect of your career you're working on. What drives you to do that, and will that sustain you over the long term? Very important, I think, to get those motivational things sorted out. The final question I'll leave you with is, are you actually going to change anything? It'd be great if you went away and you thought, that was a very entertaining talk this afternoon. But what I'd really like to see is I'd like to be able to talk to some of you 3 or 6 months from now and have you say, after that talk, I went and made this change in the way that I do things, and I can see how that's actually affecting the work that I'm doing. So I want to go back to the example of Kwang Hun that we talked about before, who really was willing to identify weaknesses among the many good things that he could do, and to work on those in a very detailed way. So that's a great place to stop. I appreciate your attention, and I hope that you found this useful. I certainly will answer any questions if there are any. Thank you. Stunned silence. Yes?
I have a question. I recently read a book from Edward Wilson. It's called The Letters to a Young Scientist. And one of his advices was to basically what he called march away from the sound of the guns. And what he means by that is, in science, it's much easier to do contributions for individual scientists in fields that are not sort of in the mainstream, if you sort of understand the point. And I would ask you, how would you reconcile that with the think big and big ideas with these?
Right. That's a great point, because I agree with the point that he's making, that if you're working on a problem that 500 other people are working on, no matter how smart you are, it's probably going to be hard to get ahead. I guess my counterpoint to that would be, in most fields when there's a dramatic advance, it involves some leap of insight that all those other people haven't made. And so what I've seen useful time and time again is to blend ideas from different disciplines. So you need to understand what those big problems are, but then often you need an angle that other people aren't working on. Okay, but yeah, it's a point very well taken. Shankar, I knew if I waited long enough, someone would ask.
Well, I just had a comment regarding the examples that you gave on performance. Somewhere in there, I guess, there's a difference between being able to repeat a composition created by Mozart or somebody extremely well, and I realize that there's nuances there that differentiate competent from the really good. But could you comment also more on, let's say you get a lot of practice, what about things that require creativity?
Right, so that's an excellent point, and often the distinction, I think, is made between a classical musician who's repeating a known piece and, let's say, a jazz musician who's creating music on the fly. I think I'm not sure that people have studied jazz musicians in the same way, but I would argue the same point is true. That in order for people to be creative in the flow and to make wonderful jazz, they need a deep repertoire of experience that they can draw upon. And in fact, the people who are doing the best creative work like that, again, they're not thinking about the mechanics of where do I put my fingers on the keyboard or the piano, right? They just think at a much higher level. So I really do think that the same principles would apply in creating something new. I would argue, as a trained classical musician, that in fact there is an enormous amount of creativity in making an excellent performance like the one that we heard on the video that I showed you also. Well, again, thank you for your attention. Go forth and do great work.